All right. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I would like to welcome you to today's program, Equity and Access in the Age of COVID-19, How Academic Libraries Can Build a Better Digital Content Strategy, which is sponsored by Biblio. Today's presentation is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas and issues in academic librarianship, free to users. These structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I would like to take just a minute or two to point out a few features of the webinar software. For those of you joining as attendees today, please know that you are automatically muted and your cameras are disabled, so don't worry about generating background noise or feedback or anything like that. We've got that taken care of. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to see a slide deck there, and that's where you can follow along with the presentation materials. We are also using the Q&A feature today. Please use that to put questions for each of the speakers. We'll take a little time at the end to get to as many questions as we have time for. We apologize in advance if we're not able to get to every single question, but we will take as many as we have time for. And with that, I would say we are ready to get started, so I will turn things over to Lindsay.
Thank you, Mark. My name is Lindsay McKenzie. I am the technology reporter at Inside Higher Ed, and I also cover libraries. So I'm really pleased to be here. And if you have any library stories, do feel free to get in touch. I'm really pleased to be joined by our panel today. We have Dave Sherwood, who is the co-founder and CEO of Biblio. Can you say hi, Dave?
Yeah, hey Lindsay. No, it's great to be here.
Thank you very much. And we also have James Wiley, the principal analyst at EduVentures. Hi, James.
Hello, Lindsay. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you.
And thanks everyone for joining. Looking forward to it.
Me too. And finally, we have Valerie Nye, the library director at Santa Fe Community College. Hi, Val.
Hello, everyone, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
Thank you. So Dave, I was going to ask you to kick us off with a little bit of a description of what Biblio is and what you do and how this all got started.
Yeah, sure. So Biblio is a learning platform that delivers electronic textbooks and courseware more affordably and accessibly to universities and colleges. We work with 140 globally, including some here in Europe and of course many in the US, including Santa Fe Community College, and Valerie's kindly joined us here today. We work with Cornell, Oxford, the University of Phoenix, so like a really broad swathe, all sort of sizes and shapes of universities. In terms of what we do and the mission we're looking to deliver, I'm a recent university student myself, and I set this up whilst at university because I, like many of the rest of us, found textbooks, expensive, and it was difficult to afford them all. And I found that dealing with print textbooks, an experience of the past, I would say. As a millennial, I was used to Spotify and Netflix, and then using my textbooks, everything pretty well was in print. And so we've set about on a mission to provide these e-textbooks and courseware affordably and accessibly on our learning platform through libraries such as that at Santa Fe Community College, with a really important point that in almost all of our implementations, the students can access that for free. So there's a really strong equity and accessibility point. Those that are least able to be able to afford content can access it for free, such as at Santa Fe Community College. So there we have it, Lindsay. A bit of background and
That was perfect.
description of what
Great
we do.
elevator pitch. Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Lou. Obviously, equity and access has become a huge talking point. We know there's been a lot of discussion about racial inequity this summer, and also accessibility for students with disabilities, particularly now that a lot of people have switched to remote learning at very short notice. I know it's a stressful time for a lot of institutions, and I'm sure a lot of libraries too. So speaking of libraries, I'd love to turn it over to Val. If you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about your experience with Biblio and how you've been using it.
Sure. I thought it would be helpful to set the stage a little bit about Santa Fe Community College and what our experience was and how COVID really brought us to Biblio. So Santa Fe Community College is a community college in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's a Hispanic serving institution, and we have open enrollment. We have an FTE of about 2,000 students, and we serve about 13,000 people in adult programs and credit and non-credit classes during a year period. The college serves primarily residents from Santa Fe County, and the county is about 150,000 people. The median household income in our county is about $60,000 a year, and a little over 12% of the people in our county are below the poverty line. The library itself has a physical collection of about 46,000 items, and we currently have a staff of 4 3/4 people in our library, and then 2 student workers. And I just want to speak a little bit about our response to COVID. And I don't think our challenges were unique, and I don't think our response has been terribly unique, except from what I understand, our subscription to Biblio has been unique. And so I want to share a little bit about that. March 13th was our last day on campus, and our campus is still closed. We have been able to go back to campus as staff, but students have not been back on campus yet, with a few exceptions. Students who are in lab classes, some of those classes have been meeting in person. And as like many libraries, we were ready to move online. We had so many things in our collection that were available digitally, and so we were able to provide quick access to ebooks and databases. We had a subscription to LibGuides, and we were able to work effectively and provide messaging to patrons through the internet that way. And we quickly subscribed to Zoom and library help for chat and for texting. And we also integrated into Canvas quickly, and were able to continue providing instruction and library reference services through Canvas, which was great. But within a week or so of being fully online, we started to realize we weren't serving our students with our reserve material. All of our reserve material was in the library, which we weren't allowed to go to. And students had been depending on that material in order to do their coursework. And here they are in the middle of the semester, not able to access the material they had been accessing. We were really grateful to get access to VitalSource, which, for those of you who don't know about VitalSource, it was open just in April and May. And it's a service that's available to students where they can buy electronic versions of textbooks. And so we were able to point many of our students there. The National Emergency Library also served as a great resource for us. So between VitalSource and the National Emergency Library, we were really able to meet student needs. But we knew that both of those electronic options would be going away in May. And early in the summer, we found out that our campus would still be closed this fall. And so we started searching for other options. And just to kind of give you some information about what we had physically in the library when it closed, we had 175 unique physical items that were available in reserve format. And that means they were available for students to check out for 2 hours at a time in the library. We circulated those items about 2,000 times a year, and we had 500 unique users who were using those materials. And I just want to talk about why this was such an emotional challenge, I think, for me, and something that I lost sleep over during the summer trying to figure out what we were going to do. For those of you who have worked at the circulation desk and have worked with reserve materials, these are students who come into the library all the time, especially students who can't afford their textbooks. They may be in the library every day or every other day, accessing the material they need to complete their class. And so the people who we were not serving were people who were familiar to me, and I felt an emotional reaction to not being able to serve them, and that we needed to still somehow provide these services. And we often hear their stories, and we know they can't afford the textbooks, and that's why they're coming into the library. So I felt it was a service we really needed to try to figure out some solutions to. In trying to do that, I talked to colleagues around the country, I followed listservs, I contacted familiar vendors, and we just couldn't find a solution until we started talking to Biblio. So in May, we started talking to Biblio, and we eventually signed a formal agreement, I believe, in July with Biblio. And we're able to do this subscription right now because we have access to CARES funds through our institution. And just talking about Biblio as our solution, its interface has been really easy for students to use. And students have been so grateful that they have access to something. And that's been really the thing that we needed to do and we wanted to do. For us, because of our budget, unfortunately, Biblio as it is right now is too expensive and isn't a sustainable model for us. But we're hoping that as the year moves on, other options through Biblio will become available, or other opportunities will make providing this continued access possible. So right now, the benefits for us using Biblio are that we're able to get access to almost all of the textbooks that students need. There's minimal staff involvement. We don't violate copyright law. We're not scanning or providing copies to students through fair use or any other means. And students don't have to pay. And students don't have to come to the library. So it's a healthy decision for us and for them. So that's what we're doing now, and how we move forward with this into the future. I don't know at this point, but I'm looking forward to hearing the discussion today and hearing what vendors like Biblio might come up with for long-term sustainable solutions for libraries. And just been really grateful to Biblio for being willing to work with libraries. Other vendors that have textbook access were not available to work with us when we started really digging into this in May and June.
Thank you, Val. I think this is definitely not just something that's happening at your institution. I think a lot of students are struggling. They can't afford these textbooks. They don't know how to access them. And I think instructors sort of don't know what to do either. It's sort of a compounded problem where no one quite knows the solution. So I wanted to ask Dave, would you mind explaining a little bit more about how this works, how you're able to offer students free access, and at what point would they have to purchase the textbook?
Yeah, no, for sure. So it's actually, I guess the origins of what we offer are sort of based on our experiences in Europe, where a lot of institutions, even well before COVID, may not have had a campus bookstore anymore, and needed to provide this learning content through libraries. And so we negotiated with publishers the ability to provide, from Pearson and Wiley and all the big name publishers, this content through libraries in a manner that is standard for them, MARC records integrated into their library search discovery layer, the library management system. So we had to build all the technology for that. And, you know, it became clear to us quite quickly that this was sort of a universal problem. Like, all libraries wanted this content. They wanted to ensure that they were giving it to the students for free. And how the model actually works is that the libraries would pay for the content, generally in the form of a deposit, and send us a bespoke list of the titles that they need to have in their scheme. And then the students have free access to the program. So essentially the institution is provisioning it for the student as such.
Thank you. So how much of the textbook can the student access? Because I understood there's a sort of a limit or a cap on how much they can see.
Yeah, so actually in the schemes that we're running here, at the scheme at Santa Fe, there's a free preview amount of, it varies, somewhere between 5 and 20% depending on the publisher. And so the students can access that much without it even drawing down the deposit. If the student accesses more than that, then it draws down the university's deposit, and essentially the student has unlimited access to that content, generally for a 12-month period, but we can do perpetual and we can do shorter periods where the publishers allow. And so the limit essentially is the deposit. So once the deposit's drawn down, then there's no more access for new users, but those that have previously accessed can continue their access to the content that they had accessed. Okay. And what we try and do is ensure when we specify a deposit that it will cover the institution for 12 months, and we use our data analytics based on other similar institutions to predict what deposit and, you know, the number of titles, the number of students. We make a data-driven estimate of what deposit will last 12 months, with the idea that an institution could then top up again in the following academic year and ensure, you know, non-stop access for all students that need the content.
Great, thank you for explaining that. So I thought that Val's case study, you know, how this is being used at Santa Fe Community College, is it raises a really interesting dilemma, which is that there are students that can't afford these textbooks, but the library doesn't always have the budget to purchase the textbooks for the students. So I wanted to ask everyone, you know, is the library the right place to be providing access to textbooks for students? You know, could it be someone else? Could it be the bookstores? You know, is this just a problem that the students have to deal with? And I wanted to throw that to Valerie first, if you don't mind, Val.
Sure. I think it's a natural service for academic libraries to offer, but I think most academic libraries don't pay for textbooks themselves. We often rely on donations from departments who purchase them and provide access to students that way. So there's an awareness within departments that textbooks may be unaffordable, or that there are groups of students who may not be able to access them through the bookstore for whatever reason. And libraries have always been interested in providing equity, and this is an important way that we do that. So as the model currently exists in this world, that students have textbooks, they need to purchase them in order to complete their coursework, I think that libraries have a role to serve.
Thank you. James, did you have any thoughts on that, on the role that libraries should be playing in providing access to textbooks?
Sure, I certainly think libraries do, as Valerie said, do have an important role. But if you look at this in terms of the requirements for teaching and learning, and also almost civil rights, you know, also the question of equity and access, then everyone should have a role, right? It should be faculty should want to make this happen. It should be the bookstore should want to make sure that this happens. So yes, I think libraries are important, but I think everyone has a stake in that decision to make sure that all students have equitable access to educational materials throughout their student journey. So I think everyone should, though I do agree that libraries have an important part.
Thank you. Dave, any thoughts on that? I mean, it sounds like you principally work with libraries, but could you work with bookstores as well?
Yeah, we have actually worked with bookstores in the past, and they are certainly an alternative option in terms of, which part of the institution can provide a similar program. And typically we see, often a library will start a program and then hire in the institution, someone in the executive could then make a decision to roll out the scheme to all of the students. And there are two ways to do that. One would be through central funding. The other would be through a student build or optional student bill. So it would be tied to tuition or appended to tuition, and students could say, yeah, I want this, or no, I don't want this. And the way it's structured, that it would save the student a huge amount of money anyway. We looked at how our prices compare to Amazon. They're often 50% lower than the secondhand and rental options, and they're often 80% lower than the retail bookstore print options as well. So it's a really big win for the student, regardless. But always we like, it's our mission to ensure that students are provided the resource either for free through central funding, through a library budget, or as part of tuition. So I and many other students have no, had no cash flow. So if you're asking them to spend that from their, bank account, they just can't do that. But if it's as part of the tuition, then, it can be done. It's more manageable that way. So it's another way to attack the equity point. I just wanted to add one statistic on the equity as well. There's a really interesting survey done here in the States, and 50% of students said they struggle to afford core necessities, like bread and milk, and 90% saying they struggle to afford textbook content. So it is a really widespread problem amongst the student group. Yeah.
I don't think it's an exaggeration when some instructors say that their students are literally choosing between, eating and buying textbooks. It's a real issue for some students, and it just doesn't make sense for them to pay, $50 to $200 on one book when they think they could get by, without it. In some cases, it's a difficult situation, definitely. I remember being absolutely shocked by the price of my textbooks when I went to university, which was in the UK. So I'm buying fewer textbooks than American students are because we take fewer courses. You tend to stick to one subject for 3 years. But it was pretty eye-opening, and I had no idea. My parents didn't go to university, so I had no idea how much these textbooks would cost. James, you mentioned instructors and the role that they can play in this ecosystem. And I know that you used to teach, and I wonder if you thought about the price of textbooks when you were assigning them to your students.
Yeah, sadly, I did not. So the context for this was I was teaching in an inner city higher ed institution in the United States, in New York City. And I just chose books that fit my course, but also books that I thought students would want to know and read for the rest of their lives. So one of them was, The Story of Art by Gombrich. And I said, hey, let's do this. And it was wonderful. And students, it was a bit of an uprising, right? The students kind of came to me quite early on and said, no, we can't afford a $400 textbook list, right? It's fairly ridiculous. I hadn't even considered the prices. No one had instructed me that there was, that I should be within a certain price band. I just chose, this would be a great book to have. This was also a course that was mandatory in humanities, so these students would never use these books again, probably, right? So they thought, why would I spend $400 for one-off book? So I did not do a great job there, but I did respond to the students, the 30 or so students who came up to me saying, this is fairly insane. Is there something else we can do? So I did respond then, and I adjusted the book list accordingly.
Would you think differently now? If you were teaching again, would you pick something less expensive?
Well, so I was certainly having 30 angry faces meet you in the second day of teaching kind of tends to change your opinion. So I would think of it differently now. And when I taught afterward, I did do that. I went to the bookstore first, and I created my kind of ideal list of books that I would like to have. Then I went to the bookstore and said, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, and whittled it down. And then I also went to the libraries as well to see just how many copies, not just whether they had it, but how many copies they had. of a given textbook because I didn't want students to work through simultaneous usage issues, right? So I learned happily, so I didn't get attacked again. I didn't make the same stupid mistake again. And the thing I did the second time was go to the bookstore, go to the library, create with your ideal list, and then whittle it down from there.
Inside Higher Ed has done a couple of surveys, and they show us that instructors are thinking more and more about the price of textbooks. It does seem to be something that is in the consciousness of professors and instructors that are thinking about these issues more and more. And I wondered, what is an acceptable price for a textbook? Print, digital. I hear kind of $50 as something that the publishers say is affordable. Obviously depends on your finances and how many textbooks you have to buy, whether that is affordable or not. But I guess, James, do you have any thoughts on, what is the price of a textbook that you think is reasonable?
It's a tough question. I mean, I think, where I taught here in the US at City University of New York, that price would be much lower, right? I don't think the students were could afford $50 or $60 for textbooks. So when I came up with my final list, I think I was averaging around 30 maybe for that, because we also found a lot of students would buy the textbook. They would ask you when you in the course, you would use the textbook, buy the textbook, sell it back to the bookstore just after that period had ended, and use that money to buy the second or third textbook. So it was very hard to figure out what the price was. I kind of guesstimated, and it was around $30, and that was my boundary. But I do not know offhand writ large what's an acceptable price for a textbook, and also really demands on whether you're going to use it throughout undergrad and grad, or whether it's a one-off course like the one that I taught.
I think resale value is something that students do think about too.
Yes.
Can I sell this again? And a lot of publishers are, in moving to digital content, squashing some of that used textbook market, which is an interesting development, and not one the students love, right? Because they want to be able to resell these textbooks and make some money. Val, did you have any thoughts on, what is a reasonable amount for a student to pay for a textbook, or if a library is purchasing a textbook as kind of a reference copy, does that get really, really expensive?
It does. I haven't run the figures for what it would cost for us to buy every textbook for our institution where I am now. I've worked for a much smaller institution, and I did run that figure. It was an institution, higher education, with about 500 students, and it would have cost us about $2,500 a semester for the library to buy the required texts for that institution. That, based on that budget, was completely unaffordable. And really the role of the library, and usually the mission that libraries have, is to support the curriculum of an institution, not things that are specific to the textbook. So not only would we shoulder the burden of buying the textbooks, which are the course material, but really as a librarian, my focus is on supporting the curriculum, the things that are outside of the textbooks and outside of the teaching classroom that students need to access.
Dave, did you have any thoughts on affordability of textbooks? I mean, you must see a wide range of prices for those textbooks.
Yeah, very so much. And credit to the publishers, I think there's a real concerted effort now, and I think generally when you look across the board, prices are coming down. One publisher that comes to mind, Sage, have been incredibly innovative with looking at new pricing models and making things as affordable as possible. So yeah, I think there's change in the market in general. Clearly, everyone's screaming out for more affordability. So I don't think things are quite there yet, but the movement in the right direction. And I think, touching on Valerie's point as well, for most libraries, providing textbooks on this sort of scale that we offer isn't something they've historically done. And so for that reason, many of them, if they wanted to expand or provide a program that could genuinely cover all the students on campus, they'd need to look at an equitable access type program, and it would need to involve, you know, the executive of the institution making a few decisions I think I touched on before. And we have a couple of schemes like that where it's a simple just flat fee per student per year for content for all their classes, like the one core content item for all their classes. And as I said before, it's about 50% less than Amazon's secondhand and rental service. So, you know, things are moving in the right direction, but of course we're all hoping that it continues and things do become more affordable over time.
I think a lot of students would say that, you know, the ideal price is zero, and obviously the publishers want to make money, and you know, the production of these materials is not inexpensive. I did want to add, Dave, that for our American listeners, a scheme in the UK is not a negative thing. I get pulled up on this all the time. I say scheme, and I think in America it has a slightly negative connotation. It's a program, right? That's the equivalent. Yeah,
or a project, exactly.
Project.
Yeah.
Not that
I'm
I think
actually
anyone
Australian.
Oh,
So
I'm
I
so
have
sorry.
yeah, exactly. So we have to learn different vernacular for the UK and then again for the US, and oh man, there's a lot of new words.
This happens to me a lot. It does.
Yeah.
So I wanted to touch on, Val said at the beginning, you know, this is a great short-term solution. Biblio came in, saved the day, students are able to get access, but it's not a sustainable long-term solution because of the budget constraints. And I know that Val said she doesn't know what the answer is. It's a really difficult problem, but I would love to ask everyone to kind of talk about what solutions they could see working. You know, where are some of the sticking points that are really hard to overcome? Are there any solutions out there? Is there something that could work? Dave, did you have any thoughts? Is this something that you're thinking about as an organization?
Yeah, of course. I think we're always looking to innovate and bring new offerings, new models, new products. Actually, we did speak to a few US libraries a couple of years ago, and our original offering, which is a bit more title by title for every student, just didn't fit and it was too expensive. And we came back recently with the model that we're running with Valerie, which is the eText Course Reserve, which is a user-activated model and it's much more affordable. I think libraries would really like to have perpetual access to content and avoid paying year on year. So yeah, there's more work to be done, and we're looking to launch a few more models later this year. I think the one that I touched on just then, the equitable access, is one that we have in the wings, but we haven't really formalized it or promoted it. So that's one that I'm quite excited about, but there's many more. And technology can facilitate a lot of these things. Like in the old world, you know, the supply chain was quite complicated with bookstore delivering content, etc. But now that it's, you know, instant access, you know, the technology does facilitate a lot of this change as well.
Great. We know that some libraries have been able to argue for budgets for open access publishing and things like that. You know, something they didn't have before, but they've made the case for. Valerie, does it seem like, you know, you argued hard enough that you could get a budget for textbooks, or is that just not a possibility at the moment?
I mean, I was able to argue to get it through CARES funds. So there's a realization that there's a need and the library can fill in that need right now. Long term, I don't know that the library should be responsible for providing this access. I think there are other ways that students can access and pay for textbooks that might eventually cut out the library, but in ways that are still equitable for the students. For example, textbooks that are purchased with the tuition fees that students pay, and that, you know, that would still be a steady fee and tuition that students would pay for regardless of what classes they're taking. But as part of that, they would get access to the textbooks they need to be successful in their class.
I think we often hear about those automated billing programs as inclusive access programs. There's a couple of different names around, and every publisher has its own sort of branding for their inclusive access program. But aside from inclusive access, another kind of option for sustainable and affordable content is open educational resources. And I wondered, Val, if that's something that you, encourage as an institution, whether you have instructors who use open educational resources, or whether you would favor an inclusive access program, or there's a little bit of a mix of both happening.
Definitely supporting open education access, OER resources. I just did a training for our faculty yesterday on OER, and as part of that, they had the opportunity to share stories. So there are quite a number of faculty on our campus that are teaching with OER, and I was surprised that those faculty are in math and sciences, which are some of the more expensive textbooks. And the faculty in those classes shared that they had moved to OER because they knew their textbooks were expensive, and they knew that the classes they were teaching weren't necessarily career classes for the students taking them, but just part of a degree requirement. And so they were looking for options for their students. I think one of the areas in our institution that we're finding difficulty with meeting with OER is the medical fields seem to have fewer OER options that are good right now. But I think the faculty in those disciplines are also aware that this is a problem and may eventually start to create OER that will be useful to students everywhere. So I feel like we're in some ways on the cusp of some really important changes and recognition in that area.
James, what do you think about long-term solutions here? I mean, OER and inclusive access kind of seem like an option. Is there one that you favor, or do you think there's something else we could be doing to make textbooks more affordable?
I would favor the OER. I think OER has two challenges. One is the perception of quality or lack of quality, right? When we talk to publishers and when we talk to faculty, they're saying, well, it's not as good as a book coming from a publisher, right? Won't be as good, can't be. It's not curated, it's not reviewed, etc. So that's not always the case. So I think that's one idea, that the perception that OER has low quality. The second is familiarity, right? A lot of faculty members just teach using books they taught before, right? And you're asking them to change their book, and no one likes change, but I think faculty members, having been one once, are a little bit more resistant, right, when it comes to that. So like breaking down that resistance, showing them that it is quality, it can be quality, it can have high quality, it can fit quite nicely into your approach, your lecture, classes, projects, whatever. So I think OER has to kind of overcome those two challenges, but I do think going forward, it will probably be, gain more traction than inclusive.
OER is really interesting because it has faced this challenge, like you said, of quality and just there's such strong brand awareness around some of the titles and even the authors, right? There's famous economists who write textbooks, and an economics professor might specifically want that textbook by that famous economist. But I do think perception of OER is changing, and it is becoming more popular. And it might not be plug and play like some of the publisher textbook solutions, but really is taking off, I think. OpenStax is a really big OER textbook publisher. If you're a librarian, I'm sure you know about it, but they have been doing kind of peer-reviewed textbooks, and the quality is, I would say, the same as a publisher textbook. So,
I would agree with them.
It's definitely changing. It's very interesting. All right. We have some questions here. I'd like to encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to submit a question to the Q&A section here. One of the questions was, is Valerie a librarian? Yes, she is. I hope we answered that one. There's some questions here about copyright considerations. And this is something that I've been wondering about, and I'm sure, Dave, that you've dealt with kind of licensing and copyright. You know, could a librarian just send a student, you know, a scan of some pages of a textbook, and is that okay? Where do the sort of the boundaries lie on what is fair use, and is it completely different depending on where you are and what kind of textbook and what publisher it is?
Yeah, so for us, the copyright is defined in the contracts with the publishers, Lindsay. So it varies from publisher to publisher. In terms of fair use, that's not something we deal with directly, and maybe Valerie has the answer you're looking for there. It does vary from country to country, but generally there is some fair use where you can share a certain amount with students. But Valerie probably has the specific answer you're looking for, I think.
Yeah, in the United States, it's 20% of an item can be shared under fair use. So just in educational institutions, it's a provision for education. But in this scenario, we might be asked by a student to provide 20% of a book, and then asked by a student to provide a different part of the book, and our limit is that 20%. So it's not 20% that we can provide per patron. It's a 20% access. So that's why we really needed access to the full text of the textbooks we were seeking this fall.
I've heard from instructors that they have run into this issue, that they want to share textbook materials with their students, but they aren't sure how much they can do. And my understanding of copyright law is very vague, but I do think it gets into quite a lot of gray areas around fair use, and gets a little complicated. We had a question here, Dave, about Biblio. What is the incentive for college or university bookstores to work with you?
Yeah, really good question. So generally bookstores, are running a service, so we'd have to come to some sort of commercial agreement with them that satisfied their, I guess, their cost needs to ensure that it was, beneficial to the bookstore to work with us. We've had a number of such agreements before, like we worked with UCCS and a couple of us at Colorado State, California State Long Beach, CS Long Beach. So we have done a couple of times in the past, and if it's interesting, we're happy to obviously have that conversation with any interested bookstore.
Thank you. Val, we had a question for you. How do you decide which textbooks to buy or provide access to, and how much do you work with instructors on these issues?
So we have a librarian dedicated to working with faculty on reserves. That's not her only job, but it's a part of her job, and it's a big part of her job at the beginning and end of each semester. We try to get all the textbooks, and we try to get them from the department. So having faculty and departments donate their purchased copies to the library. And we have a fairly decent response. Like I said, we have both, when we were physically in the library, we had about 175 items on reserve for each semester. I would say some of the things that we target, and the faculty we especially try to get copies of reserve items for, are the classes that we know have expensive textbooks, and then the remedial classes that students are taking before they're earning college credit. A lot of those students aren't familiar with college yet, and aren't familiar with the cost of textbooks, and so we're often supporting those students with textbooks, and we make sure that for that reason we have those textbooks available to students every semester.
Thank you. Dave, could you tell us how many publishers you work with roughly? I mean, are you working with the major publishers, or are there small publishers in there too?
Yeah, so 2,000 publishers altogether, and over 1 million titles and courseware as well. And we have rights to span North America and Europe. And funnily enough, you have to get a separate contract with Pearson in Europe to the one you have in North America. So yeah, we do have all the major publishers, as you said, Lindsay, and constantly expanding that catalog too. We actually have a small office in Chicago for our content operations, and are constantly adding new publishers to the list. And I would say, like, if you're an institution and you're sort of wondering what coverage we'd have, if you have like a book list or a reading list, as would be said in Europe, we typically have about 95% coverage of that, and the remaining 5% would be smaller publishers, niche publishers we don't have as partners, or out of print, no ebook available content as well.
Can you explain how courseware works with your platform? That's really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. So courseware is essentially like the next generation of the textbook. So Pearson may have an example. They have a really nice one called My Labs, where I think maths is one element of it, but essentially, rather than just a book, it's got adaptive questions, comments, interactivity, sometimes like some like calendar sort of function to help people like plan their workload as well. Some interactivity perhaps with the teaching staff or one another, video, audio. So it's like all the things you kind of expect from modern technology, with the information from the textbook kind of built into it in parts. In terms of how we interact with courseware, we provide I guess the sort of layer across all your content. So you could have some books, as a student, you could have access to some books and some courseware, and we enable you to just have it all in the same place. You can search it all with the books, and hopefully soon the courseware. You can search the full text, kind of like Google, so you get like definitions, diagrams, examples, and that really saves you having to just trawl through pages and pages and indexes and contents, table of contents, things that might take you minutes or hours in the print world, take you, less than a second in the digital. And provide as soon as well, there'll be a layer of interactivity, so you can comment to one another or to the teaching faculty across all of your content. So again, just treating the courseware, Lindsay, as the next generation of the textbook, and incorporating it side by side with the textbooks we have in the platform as well.
Some of the courseware is really impressive. There's really advanced assessment built into some of the courseware programs. But I guess a downside of the courseware and digital textbook is in general sometimes is that rather than purchasing the textbook outright, sometimes you're leasing it from the company, maybe for a semester, maybe for a year. And I wanted to direct this to James, whether it's detrimental that students aren't owning textbooks as much as they might have in the past. They might just be borrowing them for a short period of time. Does that affect your ability to learn? Is it just kind of sad that you don't have this textbook on your bookshelf anymore, after a few years? Someone here said that they still have their textbooks from the 70s, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I'm one of those insane people that kept all my textbooks. So, and I was very happy to have done it. I do think it could be a problem, right? There are some textbooks that you kind of engage with, or, some textbooks about literature or something like that, and you're like, I want to have this going forward. I don't want to have to give it back. It can be a problem. I think it would be great if students had an option in some cases, if they could, or at least to defer the purchase to another time if they couldn't. But I do think it can be detrimental. But I was, I bought every book like I was going to own it for the rest of my life, which is one of the reasons why I made the mistake I did when I was a faculty member, assuming that all other students were going to do exactly the same thing. But I do think it can be an issue, that it kind of limits, and you've written about this, Lindsay, kind of linked with the inclusive access. It does limit, the publisher controls how long you can kind of have access to it. And that might be, I know that's been open, that's been some criticism directed at the inclusive access approach as well. So I do think it can be a problem.
Yeah, this is a big discussion. I mean, part of the way that the publishers can reduce prices is that, you know, you don't own the textbook, you can't sell it on.
Right.
They gain that market share, which makes a lot of sense. And I think for most students, you know, they're taking a course they're never going to think about again afterwards. But I do agree. I think having the option to buy, if you want to, is nice. And
That would be nice.
I still have textbooks that I had 10 years ago. Not that I use them very much, but
no, I'd like to have them. They remind me of better
really
times. Yeah, they're like old friends.
They are. They are.
Mm-hmm.
There was a question here, Dave, about downloads. Can students download the textbooks, and are there any restrictions on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so students can download any textbook they want onto any device, whether that be a phone, or tablet, or PC. And in terms of restrictions, essentially, I think every 30 days they need to connect the device to the internet to check that they still have access to the content. But yeah, no, other than that, yeah, it's unrestricted offline, which is great, and even in the modern era, all of us have times where we might be catching a bus, or like different times, maybe we're traveling, etc., where you just don't have access to the internet easily. And so that offline experience is really important to ensure continued access. And the beauty as well is it's with the technology we have, everything syncs. So like if you take notes or you do highlights offline, as soon as you connect back to the internet, if you went in and used the college computer instead, it'll all be synced there as well. So everything kind of stays in sync so long as you connect the thing to the internet eventually, yeah.
I think that offline access is great because I have heard that there are lots of students that do not have stable Wi-Fi. In some cases, they're really struggling to learn remotely because their internet just isn't good enough, or they're trying to do everything from a mobile phone, which is challenging. So that's great that you thought about that offline piece. Let me scroll through here. We do have a lot of questions, which is a good thing. Excuse me. Yeah, there are people here saying, there's a comment here from Barbara Glacken. She's at a 20,000 student university library and used $7,000 to $10,000 a semester to purchase copies of textbooks for those multi-section courses, the courses with lots and lots of students. And she's saying it wasn't sustainable in the long term. So I think this is a big issue. I can see a lot of libraries will be running into this. There's a question here about making chapters of textbooks available kind of as a standalone piece of the textbook. Is that something that you could do, or is it, the student picks the piece of the book they want to read and they can kind of move freely around the book until they reach a limit?
Yeah, great question as well. So in terms of chapter thing, it's something that's, I think, very, very asked about and talked about. There are a few publishers. I know Pearson for a while, at least in Europe, had chapter access for students. I'm not sure if that was extended to libraries and institutions, but essentially, yeah, if the rights we have, we don't have chapter level access, so it would be, access to the whole thing. The beauty of the library eText reserve that we do offer, though, is that there is access for free to that 5 or 10 or 20% of the content. So often that is a chapter that the student can access before the institution's deposit is drawn down. Yeah.
There was another question here about, is Biblio better than renting textbooks? We know a lot of publishers have rental programs. I mean, the price difference is the thing that sticks out to me, but is there another advantage, Dave?
Yeah, well, that's right. As I said before, a print rental, for example, will probably be about double the price. So there's an immediate element there. As we talked about this before, but having the institution pay instead of the student sort of levels the playing field, so that if you're a better off student or a wealthier student, you don't have an inherent advantage because you can buy all the text and others can't. If the institution is providing, you know, everybody can access, which is a really important thing too.
Great. We are approaching 3 p.m., which is the end, and I think we've answered most of the questions. If you have any more questions, I'm sure that Dave or James or Valerie would be happy to answer them. Just to close out, I thought it would be fun for everyone to maybe share, you know, what is their favorite book on their bookshelf, or, you know, if you still have that textbook, which textbook is it? I have an immunology textbook, which I cannot part with, because when I look at it, I remember how much time I spent learning immunology, and it was really hard. So I felt really proud of myself for learning that content, and I was told to sell it, and I haven't. Still there. So thank you all very much. Dave, are there any books or textbooks that you've clung on to that you feel particularly attached to?
Well, I've moved so many times, like from Australia to the UK, then into London from the university I was at, that I just haven't been able to retain so many possessions. I did for a long time hang on to my main chemistry textbook. I studied chemistry. I think you studied biochemistry, Lindsay. So I had an attachment there, but I think, as James said, it was like less of me using the book and more of it sort of, yeah, the nostalgia and the thinking of the better times, you know? Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, for sure.
James, I imagine you have a beautiful library of books.
Oh, thank you. For me, I was a classic student. I do technology now, but the book that I love has nothing to do with either one of those. It was Gray's Anatomy, because I did anatomy and physiology when I was undergrad, and I just loved the book. And it's at my mother's house, and when I go home, I just kind of say hi to it when I walk past it in my old room.
And Lindsay as well, we actually signed the chemistry publisher, Oxford Press, who wrote my book, Atkins Physical Chemistry. They were our first publisher. So that book kept reappearing, and back when we were a company of 3 people, you know, I would see the book all the time, and whether it would be a bug or like a student asking a question about it, the book never left me. You know, it's always there. It's still in my demo account. When I demo the platform now, it's still there. So although I left a physical copy behind, it sort of it follows me around. Yeah,
It's haunting you, making sure you never forget that chemistry knowledge.
Yeah, exactly.
Valerie, what about you? Any books that you've clung on to or textbooks?
Very few, but the ones that come to mind are from grad school. I was never supposed to be a librarian. I went to library school to be an archivist, and I'm happy to find myself working in a library now. But so the textbooks I've hung on to are a series of archives textbooks on arrangement and description, and I remember when they were new and how they smelled. They don't smell that way anymore, but it was so exciting to get them when I was a student. So I've kept them.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I hope this was useful to everyone watching, and yeah, we'll be watching Biblio and seeing what you do next. And Valerie, good luck with the semester. And James, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thanks, Valerie. Thanks, James.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Have a great day, and we will hope to see you on another webinar in the near future.
Hope so.